Hi, Carl here for ProAV TV. I'm joined today by none other than Alister Chapman. Thank you so much for joining us. We've just wrapped to the end of our Sony Z280 focused open day, which I think went really, really well. It's got a lot of interest in this camera at the moment. I think it's really quite a popular choice in that fixed lens camcorder market. But something that came up in the open day, which I thought it would be beneficial for us to sit down and talk through in a little more detail, is HLG. Because the camera, this camera specifically, but HLG is in lots of cameras now, it can flip between being in standard SDR mode and then HDR mode, which really means HLG on this camera, doesn't it?
Yes, in this camera. You have, in HDR mode, you have HLG or S-Log, but I think for a lot of people, it's primarily going to be the HLG mode that they're the most interested in.
Now, obviously, HLG is something that is relatively new to the industry, and we're all still trying to find our way with it a little bit more. And so people are experimenting it in all different sorts of ways. And we've covered on the channel before a little bit about the bare bones and what is HLG and what is HDR. But let's start at the beginning a little bit and talk through what's the main intention behind HLG?
So HLG was a collaborative effort primarily between the BBC and NHK in Japan to produce an HDR standard for broadcast television, because the standard that's used by Netflix and the first HDR standard used for video production is one called HDR10 or ST284, and has all these various confusing names.
Fantastic names, haven't they?
Yeah, but there's all these different names, but it's basically one standard that was based on the Dolby standard for cinema. So it was a standard very much designed for cinema applications and 10-bit, 12-bit recording and things like that. But of course, in the world of broadcast television, broadcast TV often isn't 10-bit, sometimes it's 8-bit, certainly never 12-bit currently. And the HDR10 standard is quite wasteful of recording range and data and things like that. It's really not a good match for television. And of course, the big thing though is that HDR10, if you view it on a conventional standard dynamic range TV, looks horrid.
Well, this is the problem that broadcasters face. I mean, it's got to go out to millions and millions of living rooms, some of which will be on tiny little rubbish TVs and some of which will be on huge masterpiece TVs. And
So HDR10 just isn't suitable for normal television broadcasting as we know it. It requires metadata to work, all sorts of things that your TV at home, your grandma's TV just doesn't have, and as a result that type of HDR will just look rubbish. It's not watchable basically, you can't use it. So the BBC realised this was going to be a problem for them, as did NHK in Japan, and between them they got together and they developed a standard really that was specifically for television applications. And what they wanted to create was something that gave at least a high degree of backwards compatibility. So if you use it, you can view it and it will look normal on a standard dynamic range of conventional television. But if you have an HDR TV, you'll get an HDR image. And a huge amount of research went into this, looking at how we perceive dynamic range and how to best maximize recording range and data and everything else. It wasn't just a simple, let's just do it like this. There was an enormous amount of research that went into it. And the standard that came up is this HLG standard. And the big deal is it's not fair to say it's backwards compatible, because if something's backwards compatible, it's the same going backwards. So HLG isn't quite going to look the same on a standard dynamic range TV as standard dynamic range, but it's certainly perfectly watchable, perfectly viewable, and to be honest, most people wouldn't realize that they're watching something different. And that's the key. If the audience doesn't know, does it matter? And the answer is no. So the audience won't know they're watching something different. But if you've got an HDR TV, the little bit of signaling in the metadata of the transmitted signal switches that TV into its HLG mode, and as if by magic, you have high dynamic range. So you have all the benefits of HDR. So this works whether you have an HDR TV or an SDR TV. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, really, and that's why it exists.
Now, obviously, that's it from a delivery point of view. From an acquisition and in terms of creating material that will go into that standard, I mean, there's several ways really on there. There's cameras that can record it internally like this, and there's ways of doing it in post-production. But I think what's interesting about cameras that will do it internally is that it can almost replace the sort of the standard, the no grading approach, what you see is what you get type of filming.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
For most people.
Well, we already know that if we have a 709 standard dynamic range TV and the camera has 709 in it, that when you shoot, the pictures that you shoot are a pretty good representation of the scene that you shot on the TV.
Yep.
And it just simply follows that if you have an HLG TV and you have HLG in the camera, then the pictures that you shoot are going to be a pretty good representation of the scene that you shot, only with a bigger dynamic range. So, by having HLG in the camera, it's that same simple, straightforward workflow as we have with 709, only with a higher dynamic range. So it's no harder, it's no more difficult to work with, it's the same thing. There are a few little key differences, though, that can trip people up, that you have to be a little bit careful of with it. And one of those is that HLG, because it has a bigger dynamic range, and especially a much larger highlight range than you normally have, what you have to do to make space for the bigger dynamic range, especially those highlights, you have to bring the mid-range down a little bit. Now, it's not a dramatic change. It can't be a dramatic change, because if it was a dramatic change, it wouldn't then work on a standard dynamic range TV.
Exactly.
So
are we talking 10 IRE?
Yeah, it's about 10. It varies because again, it's a little bit like, so you have a 709 TV, and then in your camera you've got Cine Gamma, Hyper Gamma, 709 800, different versions of 709. So there are slight variations in HLG from camera manufacturer to camera manufacturer, and they broadly follow the same standards. But what we're looking at, certainly in the Sony cameras, so where 709 you'd expose a white piece of paper at around about 85 to 90%. With HLG, that white piece of paper is going to be about 75%, somewhere around there. So you bring your levels are darker. I mean, I have to be careful of the words that I use here, because I could very easily confuse somebody and say, you need to close your aperture down to get that, but that's not what happens. So if you had the camera set up in 709 and you switched to HLG, you would see the picture, you would see those levels come down. So it's not about exposing darker.
You have to expose the exact same, it's just that what you will see.
The levels are different, yes. So your zebras, so where you might use 70% zebras with standard dynamic range, you probably want to use 60% zebras with HLG to get the best result. And it's a really interesting thing, because a lot of people then get worried, oh, it's going to be too dark, it's not going to look right, and everything else. But if you ever look at a movie, and you look at the skin tones in feature films, 55% is not uncommon, even 50%.
They vary hugely, sometimes they vary by scene.
So don't worry about shooting your skin tones at 60%, because the other thing that happens is that because we've got this much bigger dynamic range, we have a really big highlight roll-off. So the way HLG works is it takes the big highlight range of the camera, squashes them down at the top of the picture. And that's the log part of the hybrid log gamma. So it's a gamma curve that at the top is log and at the bottom is pretty much like 709. So it takes this big highlight range and uses log encoding to encode those. And what that gives us is actually a really nice, in standard dynamic range, a really nice highlight roll-off. And because we have this really big dynamic range in the image, even in standard dynamic range, because there is a big difference between the highlights and those slightly lower skin tones, they look right. Because you can see that the scene has a big range, so you expect the skin tones to be, relative to the brightest bit of the picture, a little darker. So that 60% tends to just look right. And because it's 60% and not 70%, so it's closer to film levels, it tends to look a little bit more film-like. And I quite like the way it looks straight out of the camera, as do many, many people, which is why so many people are experimenting with it.
Well, what I think is fascinating is the people that are now using HLG as an acquisition tool, but then having nothing to do with HLG in terms of post-production or delivery at all. They're effectively using it as a standard gamma, which is not recommended practice at all. Well, it's quite interesting.
It's not recommended because it's not standard.
Exactly.
But then,
it's not what it was designed for. But does it get you bad pictures? No. In fact, they look really good.
Yes. I mean, this is the whole thing about gamma, isn't it? Is that the standard would be to record for standard dynamic range to have 709 in your camera, 709 on the TV.
Sure.
And then if you shot a test chart, the contrast on the test chart would be exactly the same as the perceived contrast on the TV.
Sure.
And that is all to
that
standard and it's all perfect. But then the reality is, if you think about it, if you then take that 709 into post-production and you grade it, or adjust it, it's not 709 anymore.
Nope.
It's something else. It's whatever your grade is called or whatever your look that you've added. It's no longer 709. So while shooting HLG and putting it on your SDR TV and is not standard, it doesn't matter. Yeah, and this is a big thing actually about gamma curves. Yes, there's certain ways it's supposed to work and certain things, but at the end of the day, if it gets you the result that you want, it does not matter.
Absolutely. It's all about creating pictures, and if the pictures look good,
Yes.
whatever way you've managed to get there is valid.
Yeah.
So I want to wrap up just a little bit by talking about some of the situations where we've started to see HLG become really useful. Like something where you mentioned just before we started rolling was people who are shooting weddings,
Yes.
which I think is a fantastic use case for it, where right now they might not have any interest in HLG, but it's giving them a great standard def gamma, just like we've just been talking about. But in the future, they've got all of that back, and it's very easy to click the HLG button in post-production or whatever and put that metadata in there,
Yep.
so that they can give them an HLG deliverable at the same time for no expense whatsoever, effectively, from an acquisition point of view.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a wedding video producer, I think it's a really good differentiator that you can use when you're trying to pitch your business to a client, to go to them and say, look, the videos that we produce are future-proof, or as future-proof as we can make them. We don't just give you a standard dynamic range video, we actually give you an HDR video. Now you'll be able to watch that on your existing TV right now and it'll look fantastic, it'll look lovely. But in 10 years' time, when your kids are starting to grow up and you want to show your kids your wedding day, when the kids start asking about it, and HDR TVs will be normal, then they will be, you'll be able to view that in HDR.
And what I love about that is that it's all using consumer technology nowadays and consumer terms that are being used by TV manufacturers.
Yes.
So they're getting the same message from their TV manufacturer that's trying to sell them a new telly, and from us in the video world trying to sell them a wedding film. They're using the same terminology.
And from you as the producer, it's not going to cost you any more.
Nope.
Most of these modern cameras now, they have it built in. So it's just a case of shooting in HLG. You don't even need to grade it. You just do your editing. You deliver the master with the HLG on it, and that's it. It's job done.
Yeah, super easy.
Yeah, so there's no cost to you, but it gives you something that might just separate you from your competition when
it gives you a very similar look to some of the cine gammas and some of the graded log,
Very
in
similar.
the way that we grade log to in that
It's
sort of
actually
environment.
very similar to the cine gammas. If you look at how a cine gamma works, so a cine gamma works by having a very deep roll-off of the highlights. So anything that's brighter than a white piece of paper is considered a highlight, and that's rolled off. And if you're using a Sony camera with cine gamma or with hyper gamma, again, you would put that white piece of paper at about 75% to be correctly exposed. And in fact, what I have found is that if you look at a cine gamma or a hyper gamma on a TV set to HLG, they look pretty good.
Yeah.
It's not quite right. It's not it's a gamma mismatch, so it's not the perfect way to do it.
Sure.
But it's a similar type of technology.
Sure.
But the way HLG works is consistent across many cameras. And with the Sony cameras, one of the things that they do is they have 3 different HLG curves
Yes.
that you use for different environments.
And that's selectable in the menu. There's just normal HLG, HLG 2, 3, and 4, right?
And that really is, I mean, the most, the simplest way to use those is to look in the viewfinder, go through the 3 of them, which one gives you the better result in the environment you're shooting in, and you use that one. There are guidelines, and I don't want to get them mixed up in the video, where I think it's 3 is the better one for highlights, and 1 is I've either got that the
One's
right way around.
better for low light and shadows.
highlight,
One's
yes.
better for outside in bright situations.
But they're designed to be mix and match within the production.
Yes.
It's not like 709 where you would always shoot the whole video in 709, because actually the HLG curves, they're all the same curve. So the look is the same. So you can mix and match them. They're just optimized for different shooting conditions.
Would you expose them the same, and would you you were talking about skin tones at 60 and all the rest of it?
There's no change there. That's the same. So what it does is, if you were to scroll through them, you would see that in one of them you'll have more information. Your shadows might be a bit brighter, but your highlights are less. And then in the other one you'll have more highlights but less shadows. But the mid-range stays the same.
Cool. Right, I think that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your
You're
time.
welcome.
And we'll see you at the next event.
Indeed.